Okay, we've got a pretty packed agenda today, so I'm going to get us to officially start while a few people are joining in. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. As I mentioned, I'm on Yugambeh land in southeast Queensland today, so I particularly acknowledge their elders past and present. And I encourage you to share what traditional land you're joining us from in the chat box. At Evidence for Learning, we also accept the invitation in the Uluru Statement from the Heart to walk together with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. And lots of exciting things have happened in the last couple of weeks on the Uluru Statement from the Heart with our new Prime Minister's announcement at Garma. So I encourage you to find more about it. And I'll ask my colleague, Susanna Schofel, who's looking after the chat tonight, Susanna's an E4L Associate Director, to share a link to a little bit more information about the Uluru Statement from the Heart, including a toolkit for educators. So today's agenda is designed for you to hear from our partners at the Education Endowment Foundation about the latest global education evidence, as well as hear from Australian school and system leaders about how they're putting evidence into action. Up front, I'll mention that this webinar and all the resources we mention are available for free online from the Evidence for Learning website. Just give us about 7 days to get the recording up, but everything will be made available without any paywalls or anything like that. You can use them as you see fit. So without further ado, we've got a fantastic panel this evening and I want to introduce you to them. We have, first up, you'll hear from Jonathan Kay. Jonathan is the head of evidence synthesis at the United Kingdom's What Works Center for Education, which is colloquially known as the Education Endowment Foundation. Jonathan works to promote the use of evidence in schools and policy making and leads the EEF's evidence synthesis work through the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. After we have a bit of a Q&A with Jonathan about the latest global evidence, you'll hear from Australian school and system leaders, including Michael Rosenbrock, who is an assistant principal at a regional Victorian public school and is one of E4L's fantastic education consultants. So Michael has over 10 years experience working in schools as an educational leader and teacher of physics, multimedia and mathematics. Then you'll hear from John Cleary, who's the General Manager of School and System Improvement at the Northern Territory Department of Education. And in his spare time, a doctoral candidate at the University of Melbourne. So John established the Northern Territory Learning Commission, an initiative which has built student-led research since 2018. So you'll hear a little bit more about that this evening. And Luke Willsmore, who is the Assistant Principal of Teaching and Learning at Emmaus Christian School, which is a K-10 school in Canberra. So Luke championed the renewal of Emmaus's inclusion support program and the use of teaching assistants to drive greater engagement of students within classrooms. Again, you'll hear a little bit more about how Luke used evidence to inform that work. And Robin Ari, who's the leader of learning and teaching at Our Lady Help of Christians Primary School in Cairns. So Robin's a teacher with 20 years experience working in both the state and Catholic education systems. She's skilled in pedagogical practices that are evidence-informed and is an instructional coach with deep knowledge on teaching, reading and writing. So you'll hear a little bit more about how Robin's used evidence in her setting too. So just a bit of framing first about why should we use evidence. It's a bit of a topic or a word that gets bandied about a lot these days. Last week, I saw an excellent tweet from an English teacher, a maths teacher based in England, I should say, to clarify that it wasn't an English literacy teacher. His name is Peter Williams, and he said that education research isn't meant to dictate the way you teach. It's meant to give you a statistical advantage when deciding what to do with your limited hours. You can't test every idea yourself. So stand on the shoulders of giants. Don't reinvent the wheel. I thought that was a great framing of how to use evidence. So the way we talk about using evidence at Evidence for Learning is that it can point teachers and educators in a direction to increase the odds of success, so better bets. But it's not a guarantee, as it's important to consider your context and what works for whom and under what conditions. So I like to think of evidence as signals or signposts. So it can help guide the way, but it's up to you to know which path to take based on your current climate. If we go with the metaphor or your context, the equipment you've got, those traveling with you. And in some cases, there is rigorous evidence available from many, many years of research, which can act as a guidebook. So pretty much is a Lonely Planet guidebook on early reading instruction. However, sometimes there's less evidence available and there isn't a guidebook, and that might be where you're switching your whole school to remote and flexible learning, as a lot of educators around Australia and indeed the world have done in the last few years due to the impacts of COVID. Oh, and one thing I will mention from our colleague at the EF, Dr. Jonathan Sharples, he talks about evidence-informed decisions are about integrating professional expertise with the best external evidence from research to improve the quality of practice. So when we talk about evidence-informed decision-making, that's what we're talking about, combining the best research evidence with your professional judgment to come up with both ideas for improvement, how to implement things, school-based projects, teaching practices. That's what we mean when we say evidence-informed decision-making. Just quickly, a little background on evidence for learning for those of you who aren't familiar with us. Since 2015, Evidence for Learning, or E4L, has worked as a national, independent, not-for-profit organisation focusing on building, sharing and encouraging the use of evidence to support educators' decision-making. So we operate as part of Social Ventures Australia, and we partner with international education evidence brokers, including the Education Endowment Foundation, hence Jonathan Kay joining us this evening. So we have, very excitingly, just launched our new version of the Australian Teaching and Learning Toolkit. It's the biggest update we've made in over 6 years. So the toolkit is designed to support busy school leaders and teachers who are looking to improve learning outcomes for their students. It summarises the international and Australian research evidence on 30 educational approaches, so everything from extending school time to behaviour interventions. And it gives an assessment of the average costs, the evidence security, and the estimated months impact each approach will have on student learning. I should have also mentioned, because I know there's a couple of early childhood educators joining us this evening, we also have an early childhood education toolkit that synthesises similar information and presents it in a similar format. We haven't upgraded that yet. We're going to do that early in the new year. So some of the changes you see Jonathan, or hear Jonathan talk about this evening, will be applied to the early childhood education toolkit in the new year. So while the toolkits don't make definitive claims as to what will work to improve outcomes in a given setting, they do provide high quality information about what is likely to be beneficial based on existing evidence. So those best bets that I mentioned, or not quite a guidebook, but definitely some important signals to help guide the way. So it's a resource that's designed to provide an introduction to the research evidence. It's not a be-all and end-all of the research evidence. One of our colleagues likes to say it's the start of the story, not the end of the story. And we really see it as a tool to help inform educators' thinking, planning, and decision-making. So now I'm going to stop sharing the slides and hand to my colleague, Jonathan Kay, from the Education Endowment Foundation, who's going to give us a little bit of a live demo of the toolkit and talk a little bit about the changes that have been in place from the previous version. And so we're going to have a bit of a Q&A with Jonathan for about 20 minutes or so. If you'd like to follow on, Susanna's just shared the link to the toolkit in the chat, and it's probably easier to follow along online. And we will kick us off, Jonathan, by if you could just talk about the new approach that's taken to including studies in this teaching and learning toolkit. So how has it changed from the previous version?
Thanks, Danny. And yeah, the aim of the toolkit, the aim of all versions of the toolkit, past and present, is to summarize the evidence in the best quality way. So that's trying to be rigorous, trying to give a really comprehensive overview, but also trying to make it really accessible to do exactly what you were talking about, putting it in the hands of practitioners, putting it in the hands of teachers and school leaders, rather than saying, do this, do that. So it's all about accessibility. And the old version of the toolkit did this by summarizing reviews that had already been conducted by academics. So we took systematic reviews or meta-analyses, but all we mean by that is reviews that gather evidence together, and we summarized those reviews. And that's great because it gives you an overview of a large amount of research very quickly. But the downside is it's very hard to engage in the detail of any one of those individual studies that's included in those reviews. So you're not able to assess the quality of them, And more importantly, you're not able to understand what's driving the differences in impact between those studies. And so the new version of the toolkit, we've had 25 poor research assistants working in Durham that have had to read, I think it's 2,600 studies that underpin all of those systematic reviews. And what they've done is they've gone through all of the underlying studies in those reviews and extracted lots of information. So information on what the approach is, where it took place, because we all know that context is incredibly important, and also the methodological details that underpin each study. And this has allowed us to do a number of things. First, it's allowed us to get rid of studies that we don't think meet the quality criteria and aren't useful in driving those educational changes. But more importantly, it's allowed us to say a lot more about what happens behind the average. So if there's a key theme behind this version of the toolkit, it's not just looking at the kind of the overall impact of something like extending school time or collaborative learning approaches. It's about digging into what sits behind that. So if we take the feedback strand, for example, there's always been a description of what it is. There's always been key findings. And there's always been a description of how effective the approach is, though each of these has obviously grown and developed as the evidence base has grown. But now there's much more that we can say about what sits behind that average. So whether things are more or less effective in primary or secondary school, whether things are more or less effective in different subject areas. And we've also developed and increased information on things like how to close the disadvantage gap, because it's really important that we don't apply and assume things work uniformly. And some of the more pedagogical differences in the evidence base. So something like feedback is a really broad category, and underneath feedback, there are lots and lots of different practices that might influence children's outcomes. And so these are quite nice. You can click through and get more of an evidence summary for particular areas of the evidence base, rather than just taking the overall averages, as well as thinking about how you can implement things in your setting. I won't talk too much about this because I know we're going to have some discussion of it later. But the thing that really excites me is underneath all of this is essentially a map of all of the evidence and education studies that feed into this. So all of the studies that we can find historically that are focused on feedback are gathered together, and you can see here the variation as well as the kind of the average. And if you want to dig into any one of these studies, you can click through and you'll get details, and you can click and see the source as well. So hopefully a really useful way of empowering teachers and school leaders to firstly get an accessible summary, but then also be able to dig into the details of the evidence base. And the final thing I should say about your question of selecting the studies, Danny, is about the principles behind this. And the key thing is that it's a systematic search and it's a comprehensive search. So we don't want the studies to be influenced by what EEF reckons might be positive or what E4L thinks might be positive. The whole point is to try and remove that kind of bias and to be systematic in the way that we view the evidence base. So before we started this project, we set out the criteria for what studies would go in. So criteria like it has to involve a school-age pupil, or it has to take place in a realistic classroom environment rather than a lab study, has to have a comparison group. But then anything that meets those criteria, before we know what the results are, get included. And the aim of this is to provide a systematic and comprehensive overview that is transparent and could be replicated. So if someone else did the same venture, they should be getting the same results. It's not influenced by the opinion of any one of the authors.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think that's an important point, and that's one of my quick tips for people looking at research in education. There's a lot of claims these days about things being evidence-based and research-based, but one of the quick tips you can look at to verify that claim is, have they done a systematic literature review? Not just a literature review, but has it been systematic in terms of what they're including and what they're not including, and how much influence did the researchers have over cherry picking, for example, certain types of research. And so that's one of the powerful things behind the toolkit. But of course, the toolkit is an evidence synthesis, and there's obviously limitations and challenges of having a synthesis of the evidence like this. So Jonathan, do you want to talk a little bit more about some of those general limitations and challenges? And we did have a question submitted from one of the attendees particularly focusing on how do you reconcile different perspectives about what the best evidence is?
Yeah, and I think the key challenge with any evidence synthesis is you can only describe what has happened, not what will happen. And anytime you pull together a diverse range of evidence, you are still displaying an average. So as much as we're digging into what goes on behind the average, there are still averages in the toolkit. And the key as a teacher is some of the things that will influence those averages can't be captured by whether it happens in primary or secondary school. They'll be captured by how well the approach is implemented in any classroom. So one of the things I like to do is look at this chart, which shows that even something as effective as feedback, it's possible to deliver in a way that has a negative impact on people outcomes. And the key thing then is, how do we apply the classroom expertise, the professional expertise, in order to try and be towards the top of that average rather than towards the bottom? And so as much as the evidence can give you those best bets, it's not going to tell you exactly how to do something in your classroom, nor should it. The aim should be the professional expertise, allowing you to apply things effectively. But you're always going to be constrained by looking at the past. And the other thing you're always going to be constrained on is the quality of research that has taken place. So it's an overview of research, not an overview of all practice. And what we try and do is be really clear about labeling the evidence quality. And now there are some strands where, because the evidence quality is so low, we haven't even put a month's progress figure, because we don't think it's responsible to estimate based on the low quality of evidence. So it's really important to look across the evidence. Then in terms of kind of reconciling different perspectives on what the best evidence is, I think there are some key principles that generally it's agreed on. So it's important to look across the evidence base. That's why we're doing systematic review rather than just taking individual studies. But within that, it's really important to examine the quality. And so we don't, for example, allow studies in that don't have any kind of comparison group. The reason for that is, in education, if you take a test, do an intervention, and then measure the pupils after you've done that intervention without comparing them to anyone else, you're always going to see some kind of positive result, because pupils are moving forward through time. So in order to have an estimate that we think is useful in terms of understanding efficacy, we think it's really important to have some comparison group, ideally a randomized control trial, but not exclusively. So the toolkit also includes designs that compare groups without it being randomized, but we do flag and take that into account as we label the evidence quality. And so the second thing I'd say on kind of what makes a good bit of evidence and how we reconcile those differences in interpretation of evidence is that narrative synthesis isn't enough. So while it can be really useful in certain settings to go into a narrative description, in order to understand what's driving differences behind the average, it's important to be able to look at these things statistically and say, generally speaking, things have been more or less positive in primary school. Or also on the quality side, generally speaking, it looks like randomized controlled trials have a lower impact or a higher impact. And that's not necessarily to help teachers in their interpretation, but that's more about how we label results responsibly and understand how those things that feed into evidence quality are also feeding into results. So the statistical analysis across is useful in terms of communicating those practice-based recommendations, but is also really useful in terms of assessing quality of studies. And what we try and do is take an approach that has signal and noise. So we gather together a large amount of evidence base. Then the key thing is how you responsibly analyze that to establish the signal and the key patterns of information within what will be a lot of noise, because not every study included in the review is necessarily a study that you individually would want to base your practice on.
Yeah, great summary there, Jonathan, about some of the pros and cons of this form of evidence synthesis. We talked a bit earlier about how how there was a new approach to, and all the Durham University research assistants coding all the studies in the new version of the toolkit. And that led to some of the impact and evidence rating changing in this new version of the toolkit. So those that were some of our frequent users will notice, John Cleary, you might be one of them, so feedback, for example, dropped from 8 months impact to 6 months impact. And teaching assistant interventions went up a couple of months. There was no sort of really large scale changes, but there was tweaks in the evidence. So Jonathan, can you talk a little bit about why some of those ratings changed?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's lots of different reasons for why the ratings might change. This isn't a small scale update. This is a 3-year project that has completely revamped the methodology. But I guess the key reasons for changes, first is new studies. So as the evidence base develops, the aim of the toolkit is it's a live resource where we keep finding new evidence and we keep updating the evidence base rather than a static resource. And so as the evidence base develops, you're more likely to get changes, hopefully things becoming more secure, but also changes in the overall impact. The other thing that might change the impact is exclusion of studies. So as I said, as we've gone through all of those systematic reviews, we've been able to remove studies that we don't think are relevant. So sometimes a systematic review might look at children, but might also include some university students. And we've excluded all of the studies that don't include school-age students, because now we have control over what goes in and what goes out, rather than relying on other academics' inclusion criteria. The second thing that I think is worth flagging is that obviously, as we've moved from systematic reviews to single studies, the padlock rating system has needed to change, because we're now discussing the quality of an overall evidence base rather than the quality of systematic reviews that have gone into it. So some of the padlock ratings have changed because it's a much more refined way of assessing the evidence base. So we're able to say what percentage of the studies are randomized controlled trials. We're able to say what percentage of the studies have happened recently, and we're able to assess the studies for how close to real classroom settings they look like. So we would say the ecological validity, has it been delivered by a teacher? Has it been delivered by a researcher? Which again is a really important element of interpretation about how likely these results are to be replicated in the classroom. The TA example is particularly interesting, I think, because that's been a real journey for the EF. When we first published the toolkit, or the English version of the toolkit, the impact on teaching assistants was, I believe, 0 months progress, which made us incredibly unpopular with a large number of the profession, but is an example of how we don't necessarily do what's popular. We go through the systematic review methodology. What's interesting is underneath that, there sat a real variation between structured interventions that had really positive impacts and between teaching assistants teaching people at the back of the classroom, often disadvantaged pupils, which had a negative impact because they weren't getting the time face-to-face with teacher. And as we go to this new version of the toolkit, that's been played out even more, because a lot of the places in which the evidence base has developed has been testing those more structured and targeted interventions. So a large percentage of the evidence base are structured interventions, which means we have a very high average of 4 months progress. But again, that's why it's so important to look behind the average, because when you look at the impact on TAs just delivering everyday classroom activities, the impact is still low. Whereas delivering targeted interventions when training has been provided or it's well linked to the classroom topic, 5 months impacts are even higher than the average that we see. So again, a really important message about looking behind the average there.
Yeah, thanks, John. Those mini strands that are within each strand are one of my favorite new things about the toolkit. Do you want to talk about some of the new insights on different approaches and applications in the toolkit? So whether it's from the mini strands or behind the averages, or different school phases. And in particular, you might want to talk, we did get a question in advance about the latest evidence on homework, and some of the new insights on that.
Sure, yeah. So obviously I get really excited about the nerdy underlying methodological stuff, but probably the messages to teachers are far more important. So I guess there's a few really interesting ones that bring out some of the principles of the new toolkit. So I think feedback is a really interesting strand, because as you said, the overall impact dropped. But when you look at the kind of what sits behind the average, it's really interesting to see that kind of oral feedback remains really high, whereas written feedback still very positive. But the key thing I'd say on this one is, applications and approaches aren't mutually exclusive. So when you look at the recommendations and how to implement, probably it's having a good balance between written and oral feedback, but not relying on things that we know are workload intensive, but less positive, like triple marking, for example, which we had real problems with in the English system in terms of the workload. And again, within feedback, this is a nice place to kind of talk through some of the implementation sections where it's not just about the kind of the overall average in the evidence base, it's about what also sits behind that and about what conditions you need to put in place in order to be really effective. So high quality feedback might also need high quality diagnostic assessment to understand how to target that feedback really effectively. Then on the homework strand, again, there's a positive impact on average, but that's an interesting one where the variation by age seems particularly important. So it's a lot more effective when it's delivered to older pupils rather than younger pupils. So an impact of 5 months rather than 3 months, but very similar positive effects across subject. One of the things I think is really interesting on homework is actually a slightly greater impact when delivered with digital technology. Now, this is a kind of an area of much discussion at the moment. We actually removed the digital technology strand from the toolkit because communicating an average for digital technology didn't make sense. There are so many different practices within that. But instead, each different strand, we've analysed the delivery based on digital technology versus more traditional delivery methods. Homework is one of the few where it seems to have a higher impact when delivered by digital technology. If you look at feedback, perhaps unsurprisingly, as amazing as adaptive learning systems might be, when things have a teacher or teaching assistant delivering feedback, the impact is still higher. So I think digital feedback is around 4 months compared with a 6 months average. So I think really interesting to think about the way that different things like digital technology might be more or less effective depending on the approach that's being delivered. And then just finally, because I'm conscious of time, my favorite new strand of the toolkit, which I think is really interesting, is the peer tutoring strands, and particularly the variation that we found behind peer tutoring, because we were able to do analysis not just on different approaches within peer tutoring, but on different actors within peer tutoring and the impact of peer tutoring on the peers doing the tutoring, so the tutors, actually was higher than the impact on the people they were teaching. And the thing I really like about this is we've had lots of discussion around small group tuition, one-to-one tuition, but there seems to be a really cost-effective pathway here that might work alongside those pathways, where by getting older pupils or even reciprocal tutoring within a classroom, you can have some of the benefits of those high quality interactions while also it being more cost effective. However, I should say there's always a catch, very difficult to implement effectively. So that's one where the implementation section is particularly important.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. There's such a rich amount of insights in the toolkit now. By doing this new method of unzipping all the meta-analyses and having all this coded in the back end of an education database, that I think it's just, if you have time to sit there and go through it, I know a lot of our educators are really time poor at the moment, but just exploring these kinds of things, there's so many new insights in there that are really useful. So I encourage you, if you are thinking about implementing something new and there is a strand in the toolkit on that topic, have a look at these applications and approaches and the implementation considerations. It'll be of great use to you as a starting point to inform your decision making. So thanks so much, Jonathan. We won't take up any more of your time right now, but hopefully we'll save a bit of time at the end for if anyone's got any methodological questions, they are best addressed to Jonathan Kay. But I'm keen to give a chance to some of our Australian school and system leaders to talk a little bit about how they use the evidence in the toolkit, both the previous and the new version of the toolkit, and how they're applying it into practice. So let me just share the slides again. So we'll have I'm going to try and save about 25 minutes of this panel discussion and hopefully a little bit of time at the end. for each of the school leaders to talk about what they're doing. I'm going to hand to Michael Rosenbrock first to talk a little bit more about using the toolkit in practice and some general guidance that we've developed recently with our partners at the EEF, and some specific examples from his context in regional Victoria.
Thanks very much, Danielle. So I'll go through some examples.
Oh, Michael, you're just, yeah, that was my fault.
Glorious. We'll try again. So yes, as Danielle said, I'll go through a few steps about using the toolkit, but also interweave that a bit with my own experience at my own school setting. So our recommendations around using the toolkit are that you first start by considering your context and what you want to achieve. In your school, it's crucial to consider the needs of your students, what you want to achieve, and any barriers you might face before adopting an approach. So for example, in my context in Wodonga, we were getting feedback from teachers and students that indicated that students were getting stuck and they didn't have the strategies or language to overcome challenges with their learning. So that then led us to look beyond what we were doing, to look for other resources, leading us to the toolkit to then look at what the evidence said. The next step is to look behind the headlines and think about what is behind the average. So whilst you can look at the front page of the toolkit, as Jonathan's just demonstrated so beautifully, when you go and look in more detail, you can see more about what's going on. So the toolkit doesn't make definitive claims as to what will work to improve outcomes in a given setting. It provides a starting point on what might be valuable, helping to identify your best bets. As Danielle said earlier, about knowing where to put your efforts and, resting on those shoulders of giants. It is important to go into detail in the toolkit strands to include the impact of approaches for different ages and different subjects. What we did in our context was to look broadly at what we were already doing and what the toolkit was telling us. That led us towards metacognition, where we dug a bit deeper into what it was telling us about metacognition, and where we saw things like it was better applied to things which were rooted within the curriculum context, which fitted what we were already doing, and the importance of teachers modeling their own processes and developing metacognitive talk, which was a really nice link to a lot of work we were already doing and things we were already trying to implement around literacy, which is kind of what led us towards metacognition as being a key point of work. So by looking further into what the toolkit was telling us, we were able to not only refine our thinking, but also see how it fitted in the bigger picture of our own work. There was also some good evidence, some good additional information around the impact of metacog on disadvantaged students. Potentially the evidence is some evidence there at least that disadvantaged students are less likely to use metacog strategies, which was also fitting with our experience as a school with a high level of disadvantage. Thinking about cost and evidence as well as impact is the third step. So some approaches may be effective, but not cost effective. Other approaches may have a lower overall impact, but may have a more well-established evidence base. In the case of metacognition, it's one of the standouts with significant impact, extensive evidence, and very low cost. The fourth thing is to draw on your professional expertise and consider implementation. The toolkit can tell you whether an approach has a good track record, but your professional expertise, other resources, and ongoing evaluation are also important in making well-informed decisions on what is best to support students' learning. Adopting a new approach requires careful planning, implementation, and monitoring. This is very much the case in our setting. We had gone down this path and done some fantastic professional learning with evidence for learning on metacognition. And that was about March 2020, and things got very interesting from there in. So we certainly had to adjust our plans for implementation extensively. But having plans in place, having an approach to monitoring and evaluating what we were going to do was really important in allowing us to adjust to things as they changed. So that's my brief rundown on using the toolkit.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michael. That was really useful to weave what you did at Wodonga into those 4 steps, which are summarized with a little bit more detail in our Using the Toolkit's guide and our school leader reflection tool that's to help surface some of these questions and inform your thinking. They're both 2 new resources for this latest version of the toolkit. Now I'm going to hand to the fantastic John Cleary. This is one of E4L's favourite projects ever, I think, John. I think all of us have had something to do with it over the last 4 or 5 years. The last time I was in a room with a bunch of the Northern Territory Learning Commissioners, we had students presenting on how much impact feedback had on learning, getting the exact number of months impact right from the toolkit. So John Cleary is a master of mobilizing and using the toolkit to not only inform what teachers are doing, but also what students are doing and thinking about their learning. So I'll hand to you now, John.
Thanks so much, Danielle. And yeah, I'll be excited to see the 8-month to 6-month change. So I want to understand what that's about, right? And diving into it. And Jonathan, I share your passion and energy for this too. It's so exciting to see the evolution of the toolkit over the last number of years and the depth that's there also as well. So we're really excited. So my name is John Cleary. I'm the General Manager for School and System Improvement in the Northern Territory. I have been till over the last number of years, but before that was I was the principal at Casuarina Street Primary School in Catherine in the Northern Territory, which is where the Learning Commission grew from back in 2016 for a small number of schools, now through to about just over 30 schools across the territory. And so I acknowledge the Larrakia people, the traditional owners of the land on which I get to live, grow and learn in beautiful Darwin, the Northern Territory, and their elders past, present and future. And the important thing for us in the Learning Commission is just that it's about students, principals and teachers coming together, each bringing their own shared expertise, whether it's students in terms of their experience as learners in their school, principals who make space for the recommendations our students make, but also our teachers who bring that deep pedagogical understanding and expertise to translating and changing that into practice. And so essentially, on a simple level, the Learning Commission is about students, leaders and teachers working together to explore data and evidence to make recommendations for the next steps and improvement for their school. But I'll hand over to some of our Learning Commissioners to explain it better than I can. So I'll hand over to you, Danielle.
This has been a fantastic year for the Learning Commission. The Learning Commission work has been a lot richer. We've gone through that thought processes and decision making into a much deeper level. So COVID affected us that we couldn't all meet in person, but it didn't really affect our work. Meeting through Zoom was great. We still had all those connections. I don't think it really affected us in a negative way. It made us have to reflect ourselves a little more rather than relying on our partners. But then when we spoke to our partners, we were much more focused on the questions we needed to ask and the help that we needed.
I think every school should have a learning commission because I think it's really beneficial for learning and teaching. And I think one thing to think about is if you're starting off, I think surveys are the best thing because then you can understand what your school's lacking or what they have improved on. I think surveys are really important for that.
Coming together, like most of the schools from Darwin to Catherine, and we're all coming together to find out the ideas and see how we can present this to the Minister of Education and improve ways how teachers can teach and how students can learn.
This year we have been focusing on CCT, critical and creative thinking, which is a part of the Australian curriculum and general capabilities, and we have been figuring out if the teachers are explicitly teaching it and found that they're exposing it but not being explicit about it. So we have been creating surveys, looking at data and creating new learning intentions. Next year we are going to have it as a part of our learning plan, and the ACGC group are going to include it and focus on it more.
And I'll Jessica there, the incredible Alaba Primary School in Darwin, where the work with data and evidence for their students is kind of deep in the DNA of that school over a number of years. And Sandy Cartwright, who leads that school community, does an incredible job. So the growth, I think our line is that we're going to need to, the kind of Jaws line, we need a bigger boat, we need a bigger room now as the commission continues to grow. But it's really about that. And when people hear our students talk about data and evidence in longitudinal trends in their school and what it means when they engage with some of the evidence that the Teaching Learning Toolkit provides for them, their line is always, I didn't think students could talk about their learning in that way. And what we find consistently is that they absolutely can, carefully, respectfully, deliberately, but with an appetite to both explore and learn from the evidence available. So how does it work? On a really, again, sort of simply through the same inquiry cycle that our schools use in their improvement planning each year is the same inquiry cycle that our school commissions use. And our commissions are made up of teacher commissioners, principal commissioners and student commissioners working together to firstly in the assess stage, to explore those longitudinal trends, both in student achievement, growth, and participatory data, as well as perception data also as well, which helps them develop particular lines of inquiry to explore in their set goal stage, where they then begin to start to understand what's the story that sits behind those lines of inquiry and those trends in longitudinal data at the school. In the plan stage is where the toolkit really comes into its own for us. It's where then as students, and I had best bets mentioned a number of times today as well, where those students and teacher commissioners and principal commissioners are working together to understand both the student experience behind that trend, but then potentially working towards recommendations around what the school might be able to do next to step forward in their improvement journey. And the toolkit plays a really key role in not just exposing what is quality evidence for students to be able to access and teachers to access, in synthesizing it in a way in which it's accessible and also a reliable source. There's not many principals and teachers that spend their evenings and weekends reading literature reviews, let alone systematic ones. And so the ability to make that something which is accessible has been a key part of the work of the Commission also. And I acknowledge our partners at Evidence for Learning who've been with us right the way through the journey. But the key element for that too is those considerations for implementation in your school as well. And as we moved into the ACT stage and into the review and adjust, it's about the commissions making a recommendation at the end of the year, which becomes the focus for that school's improvement plan for the following year. So that's the end of their work across that year and that continual commitment to that improvement and the recommendations that students have made. But it is important when we think about the impact evaluation cycle that often through a commission, the outcome of that work may well be that they'll embed that in their work going forward as a school, but it's also important to consider that omit, or actually the work that they've done has led them to a point where they say this isn't going to be something we move forward with. And asking that question, what would it take to convince me that I was wrong, or that potentially this isn't the way in which we should move forward together. So right across that cycle for us, if I move into the next part, is talking to our students about, and our teaching learning commissioners about quantitative and qualitative data, and understanding the roles that has in drawing upon both that quant and qual data in evaluating impact of the work that we do. Our commissioners use the LOC system and have right the way throughout their journey as commissioned schools, both to think about and consider the strength of evidence, strength of the evidence they're looking at, but also the evidence they're drawing upon at their school level also as well. And the both volatility and sample size of the data in which they might draw upon. Perception surveys are always a really good example where the jumping around in some of those surveys at times can see schools make long-term policy decisions or improvement decisions on what is perhaps an unreliable sample for that decision to be made. So we do talk to them about their impact, the cost, and also the evidence security. But again, I'll let some of our commissioners talk to you a little bit more about what it means to them.
We headed over to the Microlog Center, where we learned about qualitative and quantitative data.
It helped us to better understand how to gather and graph our data.
Quantitative is data with numbers and qualitative is data with words.
We use the LOC system to judge if our data is secure.
And so our fantastic commissioners there from Leania Primary School in Darwin. And when we ask our commissioners to describe for us what do they mean by good evidence, these are some of the things that they say. First of all, a substantial amount of it. So was it 2,300? I heard 2,600 studies there, Jonathan. So you certainly got support from our commissioners for that. But then also the focus for them, again, unapologetically on whether the significant energy and considerable energy for teachers and leaders and students is focused on efforts which provide the best opportunity for improvement and growth in learning of young people to occur. So it's a really kind of key focus for our student commissioners. And the last pitch that I'll just share there, Danielle, is where this is way back in my days as principal at Casuarina Street Primary School. I think this was 2017. For our commissioners there who'd led both a inquiry cycle through to understand and think about what were the most consistent characteristics of the teaching of reading in our school, where the most significant growth was occurring, using the toolkit to support them in that work. And when they shared that, what I love about this photograph is that we had not just teachers from Casuarina Street Primary School attend this opportunity, but from right across the region, some of whom had driven 200 kilometers to come in and work with our students that day to focus on those characteristics and to explore evidence and the student experience of when great learning happens for them in the school. So I'll hand back to you.
Thanks so much, John. I always love hearing. I've heard you talk about the NTLC for many years now, and I love it every time and learn something new about what you did. And just congratulations to you for championing this work over such a long time and seeing how far it's come. And nothing beats those student testimonials of students being able to speak about LOCKSS, evidence security, qualitative and quantitative data, and talk so coherently about their learning and growth and aims. And when I was in the room in Darwin with a lot of the commissioners late last year, the way they were talking just about all of these types of things, and we want to focus on feedback because feedback has 8 months learning, or we want to set our attendance goals at 95% attendance. So the high expectations they had and the targets they had were incredible. So I just can't congratulate enough for the vision that you've had and saw that vision through for the long challenges of implementation that comes with making these things come alive and scaling them across the system. So next, we're going to have another one of the E4L favourite projects. I'm going to get Luke Willsmore from Emmaus Christian School in Canberra to talk a little bit about how he built a case for change on teaching assistants in his school. This is one that is topical at the moment, teaching assistants. So, and Luke's got a fantastic story about using the evidence, using the guidance reports, and how he influenced and implemented change in his school. So I'll hand over to you, Luke.
Thanks, Danielle. So yeah, obviously, as Jonathan mentioned, the data when I began this journey 3 or 4 years ago of looking into initially how to improve our learning support at Emmaus was not great for learning assistants. So I actually ended up using the Evidence for Learning Toolkit to build a case for doing exactly what it said not to do, in that is putting in teachers' assistants into our school. So we run quite a heavy program of teachers' assistants now. But that journey came from a point where there was a massive impetus for change. We were realising that our staff were struggling with the differentiation, and the way we were meeting the needs of our diverse learners just wasn't up to scratch. So there was a huge impetus for doing something, and I ended up going to the toolkit, looking at the evidence, going, okay, well, how can we support these staff? What can we put in place to help these teachers sort of meet the needs of all the kids that are in front of them? And looking through, there was quite a few different strands within the toolkit that had really positive impacts. So the one-to-one tuition, small group tuition, individual instruction were all strategies that seemed to have really high impact at the time. And ultimately, TA use, when you dug down into the data in the toolkit, looking at the actual reports, it was the way they were employed that wasn't necessarily working. So by viewing TA use and the ability to use teachers' assistants to actually support staff, teachers to put those other strategies into place, allowed us to see, to piece together a case for a very big change in our school where we've completely shifted away from withdrawal style of education to very inclusive, keeping all the students in the main classroom, but supporting the staff to do that through providing TA support. So the toolkit was instrumental, and it was the whole grounding of the ability to make that change, in that it pulls together the case for you. It takes all the work out of trying to sell a change to a school board and to my principal and even ultimately to the staff. Having that impact clearly on the graphic at the start, the very, very high level kind of data security and impact, months of impact, allows you to sell to someone, oh, this is going to work. We can see how this is going to be able to be pieced together. The more complicated thing was then putting together, okay, well, how are all these strategies going to come together? We're actually using multiple different strategies in the one case, and that's where digging down into the actual research behind it, and you know, I love the fact that you know, the new studies that have been included out of the UK have really shown that there is an impact if TAs are used well. So we're sort of, that wasn't there when I started, but it's great to see that the change has been sort of replicated across the research. But putting together those multiple strategies and building the case was something that Evidence for Learning and the toolkit was, yeah, the only real way to do it. Digging deeper into those studies was allowed us to sort of ultimately arrive at the same destinations that the the guidance report, which came out after we started this journey, pulled together beautifully. So now with those guidance reports, it saves you even having to necessarily dig right down into the deeper studies, but it does put together that, how are you going to implement this change? How are you going to roll it out in your school? And how are you going to assess whether it's actually effective? So for us, it's been an amazingly beneficial project, and very, very linked back to the origins within the toolkit and attempting a crazy mashing together of strategies.
It's such a great story, Luke, about how you really intelligently use the evidence in a way to guide your professional decision making, not just sort of using it as, it's not sort of coming at you as like, oh, we're just going to follow this blindly, but we do want to use the resources that we have in our school, which are teaching assistants. We're looking at other strands, like if you can get impact on one-on-one or small group tuition, how can you apply that to how you do teaching assistants? And as you said, I think you've, as you discovered by delving into the depths of the toolkit, you found like some of the recommendations that were later drawn out into our guidance reports on making the best use of teaching assistants. And like there's no sort of correlation with this that is definitive, but a lot of the work that EF has done in England over the years of changing this narrative on how you use teacher assistants more effectively has led to some of that. You can see the impact that teacher assistants now can have. If they're used really well, you can have a really big impact on students experiencing disadvantage or having learning difficulties. Whereas before, there's a lot of negative impact of teaching assistants if they're not used in that intelligent manner. So thanks so much, Luke, for sharing your story. It's a great one. It's a great use of research evidence to inform change over a number of years in a school. And finally, I'm going to hand to Robin Ari, who's another one of our favourite projects and stories of using evidence. So we've worked with Robin over a number of years with our professional learning partnership with the University of Queensland Science of Learning Research Centre. And so, Robin, do you want to talk a little bit about what you've done in your Cairns Primary School on feedback and writing over the last few years, and things like how did you know feedback was going to be a high impact strategy and how you went about introducing that change in your school?
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. The feedback on writing project that I was involved in, it started in 2019, and as Danielle said, we're on Gimwai Wullaby Yindinji and Yurgandi country, also known as Cairns. In response to the NAPLAN data that you see up on the screen in 2016, the school had already engaged in an extensive improvement journey, implementing consistent evidence-based teaching strategies focused on student writing skills. The implementation of this strategy resulted in consistent improvement in the school's NAPLAN writing results above and beyond the state and national averages. And I've got a good news story for the last slide as well. So the project members and myself decided to focus on feedback as we were challenged to identify good pedagogy for the teaching of writing skills appropriate to different age groups in primary school. So we also wanted to improve teacher capacity through investigating classroom practice and teaching writing. And we really wanted to facilitate that collaboration among colleagues in action research and actually sharing the outcomes. So what we found out was that wherever students are in their journey along that writing continuum from novice to expert, their ability to use self-regulation skillfully requires deep thinking. So despite this success, teachers that you see in the previous slide, sorry, Danielle, teachers expressed concerns over the degree to which students still relied on the teacher for low-level feedback on approval of student planning of ideas and revision of written work for simple errors, including editing, which inhibited the teacher from working with a greater number of students on higher impact writing strategies. Our teachers were expressing concerns that students were waiting for teachers to spoon feed them, for want of a better word, and they were seeking assistance on how to improve this in this area of self-assessment and higher order metacognitive skills. So on the next slide, Danielle, the intention, so what we did was we referred to the Evidence of Learning Toolkit and dug into this information, and also the guidance report was available then, to come to a decision that the professional development for teachers had to focus on feedback. And now we can call it oral feedback if you see the update in the toolkit, which is fantastic. So I guess oral feedback typically involves the spoken comments from the teacher either to an individual, group or a class. So we did as well stand on the shoulders of giants, and the giants are Hattie and Timberley and their model of effective feedback, which may look familiar to you. The research group developed a hypothesis that students lacked this metacognitive skill to improve their writing, and using this model that you see, it was noticed that teachers had inadvertently favoured praise and task-focused feedback in their classrooms. So the Action Research Project collected classroom observational data in the form of conversational storyboards. So yes, we wrote down every single thing a teacher said and then themed it into a task, process, or a self comment. And this observational data actually did support our hypothesis. So the impact of oral feedback, as we know now, is higher on average than the impact of feedback overall. And as we've sort of debated already, through looking at the updated version in the toolkit, the average month's progress was actually 8 months when we started our journey, but the cost was still low, so that hasn't changed. And this was all found in the toolkit, and very, very the thing that really sold us on keep pursuing with this. The question stems you see here were created after we consulted The Power of Feedback by Hattie and Timberley, and this paper assisted us with those questions that you see. Where am I going? Sorry, how am I going, and where to next? And that could be used from both the teacher or the student to each other. So as we know, we found out feedback is a very high impact strategy, and it informs the student and teacher about the student's performance relative to the learning goals, particularly in writing. So effective feedback will redirect or refocus the teacher and student actions. So the student can align their effort and activity with a clear outcome, and that leads to achieving their learning goal. On the next slide, Danielle, you can see that a reflection of our 2021 NAPLAN data. In this slide, we knew feedback was a high impact strategy, particularly with our Year 5 students, you can see at the top. And the toolkit, the updated version, particularly advice on implementing feedback successfully. And if I'm really reflective about the process that we used, I've picked out a few things that are actually there now that we actually used. So first of all, assessing student understanding so that you know what needs to be improved. So drilling down into the vocabulary of writing, the sentence structure of writing, the spelling, the grammar, the punctuation. So knowing what to target first. Considering the cost associated with different feedback practices and the professional development involved. So we all want bang for our buck, and we all try to go about it in that way to save money. We carefully considered how feedback will be received, including on self-confidence and motivation. So what we found was praise still had a place in the feedback, on the feedback table. It wasn't something we wanted teachers to stop doing. It really had a place. And providing opportunities for students to act upon the feedback after it had been given through time, and an opportunity for students to edit, review, and respond by allowing the time to do it. So the feedback guidance report on the Evidence for Learning website does explain that feedback interventions can vary in length, and for ours it was sort of a shorter length, had a targeted approach, and it did address some misconceptions of teachers, and it took a few months, to be honest. So I suppose I just wanted to finish on some advice. So I guess when introducing or considering a new approach to feedback, what we considered was the implementation of the professional development. And I do suggest the use of the Evidence for Learning implementation guide, also on professional development, the guidance report on that, and the recommendation in there to firstly build the knowledge, motivate the staff, develop the teaching techniques like the question stems, and we also use learning intentions and a bump up wall, and embed that practice first before moving forward. Thanks, Danielle.
Thanks so much, Robin. What some excellent advice that you've left us there with. We're nearly at time, so I will make a couple comments. Thank you for the questions that have come through. Thanks, Susanna, for sharing a little bit more information about what we've written up about what Luke, the amazing stuff that Luke's done at Emmaus. If you have any further questions, feel free to get in touch with us and we can put you in touch with Luke if we don't know the answers ourselves. The other thing I'll mention is thanks for the question about the disadvantage gap and is it possible to sort interventions by closing the disadvantage gap? John, Kay, I don't know if you want to spend 30 seconds just talking about some of the evidence on the disadvantage gap and like what the EF's plans are with that, and sort of the amount of evidence you found or did not find related to that?
Sure, and I think it's one of the biggest challenges in the evidence base, and one of the biggest calls to action is not enough research groups have that data that looks at disadvantage. And this is another important point, quantitative data is obviously incredibly important in measuring efficacy, but often that behind the disadvantage gap section will draw on the qualitative evidence, which is also really important in terms of identifying barriers, identifying pathways to change that might work through disadvantage or support it. And I think it's very different from different approaches. So for example, summer schools often have particular risks to disadvantaged pupils in terms of attendance, where we might need to be really careful about how we target them and encourage disadvantaged pupils to attend. Whereas things like small group or one-to-one tuition might be more easy to target at particular students. So it's really important it's case by case. And EF has actually just commissioned, a while ago commissioned a systematic review on the causes of the disadvantage gap, which we're hoping to publish in the near future, and which will develop these sections still further.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Jonathan. Great questions. Thank you very much for your attention and your time this evening, to both everyone who attended and to all of our panelists. We really, really appreciate it. I think it shows both the diversity of the thought that goes into the Teaching and Learning Toolkit from the EF, the team at Durham University, and all the Evidence for Learning team about how to make it useful for you, and also just the amount of rich, different, varied, intelligent ways that you can put this evidence into action. So thank you to our Australian school and system leaders for joining us and sharing their stories. And yeah, please do contact us if you have any questions or have any feedback. And Susanna will share the link to our survey. It's really helpful if you can fill that in. It only takes a few minutes, but you can nominate other topics for future webinars or anything else that you would like more information on.